And good evening. It's August 13th, 2024. We're in our next collection of discussions in our Outside the Class series. It's a series from the Bible Project. It's about the entire TaNaK, right? The entire Old Testament. On TheDustyFeet.com, in that Outside the Class section, we have this TaNaK, this Old Testament source video section, of course, set up for your review. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first. They would be found in that source video playlist. Because we try to keep these to about 15 minutes. Because we want to make them easy to catch up on. So we're on a quest. Scroll by scroll, book by book. A journey through this collection, but with a fun and different twist. On Outside the Class, on the Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click that subscribe button. Those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you do think that these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these with more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire TaNaK, the Old Testament, right? Yet we're going to be doing it in the original order of the collection, the Hebrew Scriptures order. So it could get really interesting once we get past these first 5. Because remember, these videos we're going to discuss, they're just the tip of the iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. They can all be found on the Bible Project website. And of course, also in our source video playlist. But remember, as we are in this series, I want us to really remember that there'll probably be more questions sometimes than there are answers. We're going to try to respond to some of the information, and as we discuss it, I'm going to leave it up to you if it's actually an answer. Because there are going to be many questions. We're going to be asking about all kinds of things, of which we're probably not going to know or get one. It is what it is. So, Exodus, Shemot, 1 through 18, chapters 1 through 18, and this is part 2. So we left off with Moses being raised under the very nose of Pharaoh, raised by the man who tried to kill him unsuccessfully. And now this Hebrew child will become what we know today as Moses, and he, with a little prodding from God, will lead these covenant-promised children of his out of Egypt. The burning bush story has always fascinated me because we have God with the covenant with Abraham that he went along with, Abraham did, but he didn't need an event such as this. But Moses did. So now maybe I'm thinking, maybe he did this because Moses, well, he was raised and so ingrained with Pharaoh that he knows how Pharaoh's going to respond. Tim brought up that point, that in this discourse between God and Moses, he says that Pharaoh will resist. Moses, well, he knows Pharaoh. So he knows what Pharaoh's going to do. But I think God uses to say, you think this is a big deal with me talking to you in this way? I think just wait till you get there. Wait till we get to the big show later. So this whole burning bush is just a fascinating story that's worth a study in and of itself. So I highly suggest that you go back and read it because there's a lot to unpack there. But here we're talking about Moses. A long time later, he's 80. I mean, he left Egypt at 40. There's a messy story there that we like to defend. And then he's out with Jethro. Now he has a wife and kids. 40 years later, we get this event. It's not a spring chicken anymore. We're just talking to burning bush. This 80-year-old man is being tasked with something quite extra, right? Extraordinary. So we're in this burning bush discourse with God, and there's a hardening of Pharaoh's heart. You know, if you look at the Hebrew, it's a little more interesting than that on the surface. I was actually part of a Jewish study on this particular part. And what we have here is where Pharaoh was given over to his proclivity and his hardness of heart. You know, it's as God does with us. Just like Pharaoh, whom we on the surface would never identify with, And yet our actions may, at many times in our lives, exhibit that exact same behavior. We just don't have the fate of an entire nation to suffer the consequences of those choices of ours, at least for the vast majority of us. But God will totally let you go right down the path that you're going to go. You're going to resist. With a hard heart, that's where you're going to resist. And actually, what's interesting when you really think about this, also what fascinates me about these kinds of stories, because we continue to see ourselves. We see God involved in our lives. We're always looking, right? We always have that backward view, though. We seldom see it in the moment. It's not impossible, but we seem to seldom see it in the moment. So we're looking back at it. You know, my dad's actually writing a book about his life. So look back. One of his working thoughts is, and then there was Jesus. So then there was Yeshua, right? Jesus was there with him. And yet, his heart still had to change. And there were people involved. Messengers. And in that setup, it's to look back. So what we say is, this is our resistance to things, right? Often it's because it's just our resistance to God. We're not ready. But truth, neither was Pharaoh, and he, like us, we are given multiple chances to choose differently. You know, to stop the consequences to himself and others. But yes, Pharaoh really believed their hype, that he was a man god, that he was all that and a bag of chips. And we see him then given over to himself. God's not going to rescue him. God will go along. Maybe even push harder. But does that sound familiar? At times, we already have that hard heart. We need to allow the change. It's us that makes it hard, along with this guy that we supposedly don't really identify with. We have choices many times as well. And we need to remember, it's not the position though, it's the person. I want us to keep that in mind. Because, you know, there were pharaohs that were not abusive of their power. The Pharaoh with Joseph leaps to mind. He chose to listen. But heck, Israel, in the land that God gave them, had good and not so good kings. So it's not the position, it's the person. Because some of them listening to the prophets, others not listening at all. So we have good pharaohs and not so good pharaohs, and this particular not so good one, he's given over to himself. Now God will get his attention. You know, I personally, in my paradigm, I don't view this as a power struggle between man and God. It's not really a fair fight. But I don't think that's the purpose. I think it's about whether anyone, in authority or not, and it's whether they will listen. It might also have an element of the messenger, because here God did use Moses. I love how stories develop in this story, from the garden up to now in this part of the story, because, you know, God used a dream with the other Pharaoh and with Joseph to get his attention. So God could have done that here as well. Yet maybe the messenger was important, you know, who he was. That even though this Pharaoh, trying to kill off an entire generation of these children of Israel, ended up raising this one as his own. So now this messenger, 80 years old, weathered, wizened, and now claimed to be backed by a powerful God, it's going to get Pharaoh's attention. You know what interests me in this man-power struggle? His power only really lies in how far he will let his choices affect himself and others. You know, with the Pharaoh in Joseph's time, he used his power for the good of many people that ended up actually going across his borders beyond. This Pharaoh, he's going to make choices that will adversely affect those not only in all the land, but also those around and most dear to him. The other Pharaoh, He brought life to so many with his choices. But this Pharaoh, he's going to bring destruction and death. Who knows? Maybe Pharaoh thought, these threats, these promises from Moses, well, they're going to affect everyone. So Pharaoh could have thought, if that happens, it'll backfire on you because you're going to suffer too. But as we know in the story that we're reading back, that's not actually what happened. They, those Hebrew slaves, were spared, protected, rescued. Yes, these plagues are designed to attack the reputations of those gods of Egypt. It's to bring their names and their authority into disrepute. So the last plague dealt directly with Pharaoh, right? That Pharaoh that had killed all of those Hebrew children. This last god from whom God will lay waste will cost him dearly. Directly dearly. Only anyone who follows the instructions of God, only they will be protected. They will be passed over. Anyone who obeyed. That Passover lamb, the blood, didn't cover up sin. It was not forgiving sin. The blood was to be rescued from death. The Passover lamb, the way to escape death. It's then and now. Then, physical death, right? The first death that we all account for. And our Messiah as Passover lamb, well, there's a second death to be accounted for. And that blood, same purpose, just with forever ramifications. But God says in this, I want you to remember this. He's telling the story, and God gives us some instructions on a good way to remember this. We might want to pay attention. Because there are so many elements between this story and all the stories surrounding Jesus. So many red string connections, a cacophony of echoes. But these, I think they're making a beautiful sound. Because that Song of the Sea is an amazing song sung by Moses when they're rescued by God through the Sea of Reeds. This kingdom of God story. Did you listen? The Lord reigns as king. He confronts evil. He redeems the slaves. He leads his people to his kingdom. And he dwells amongst his people. Does that kingdom of God story sound familiar? I mean, do we have his son, God's son, echo this very story, reference each element in the story? Echoes forward to the Messiah, echoes back from the Messiah to this Exodus story, this redemption story, and will lead us to these two mounts. We've been talking a lot about Mount Sinai and the Sermon on the Mount. Two events entwined, elements overlapped and inlaid. So I'm guessing that the next section of Exodus is going to give us a lot to look at, because it seems the Messiah, he did the same. So next week, with Exodus 19 through 40, we're going to get into the Mount event and the attitudes and the hearts that are part of this. And maybe a mirror to look at ourselves. Because when looking at things a bit differently at times, it can be uncomfortable. It can be challenging. But sometimes it can be fun, because the kingdom of God, his ways, his instructions, his justice, his mercy, his grace, it's just Jesus echoing his Father. So, thanks for with us tonight on another edition of Outside the Class, the TaNaK, right? The Old Testament, on the Dusty Feet.